You're thinking about trying out therapy, but you're wondering which type is best for overthinkers and overachievers. In this video, I'll describe what it's like for an overthinker to do cognitive behavioral therapy versus acceptance and commitment therapy, so you'll know which one is best for you. Hi, I'm Kira Hensley, and I'm a registered psychotherapist who helps women who are overthinkers and overachievers manage their anxiety so they can do more of what matters to them. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT for short, focuses on people's thoughts or cognitions and how this affects their feelings and behaviors. So, for example, in a CBT session, a client would describe a situation that's distressing to themselves, and the therapist would help them figure out what thought led to those feelings and how they acted in that scenario. So an example from school that I'm sure all overachievers can identify with is test taking. So you're sitting down to do a test, and it's obviously really important for you to do well. And the emotion that shows up is fear or anxiety, and that feels pretty clear to you in that situation. So this affects your behavior by maybe going over your answers again and again and again until the teacher finally pries it out of your hands when the exam is over. Now, in the session, a therapist would help you identify what thought led to that fearful behavior and holding on to that test till the very end. Likely the client would be able to come up with thoughts like, I need to maintain my average, so I need a really good mark. The person in front of me turned the page first, so obviously I don't know my stuff that well. Or I didn't know the first question, so clearly I'm going to fail. Together, the therapist and the client would identify the thought errors that occurred. So, for example, in the I'm going to fail because I didn't know the answer to the first question, the therapist would help the client identify that they were catastrophizing. They're taking something insignificant and making it into a really global problem, failing the test. And then they would come up with another thought that you could replace that with, like, even if I don't answer the first question, it's just 5 marks. I'm going to do fine. Or the therapist would help the client find evidence against that thought, like, how many tests have you failed before? What's the likelihood that you're going to fail this one? Then the therapist would assign homework, such as on the next test, the client can use their new thoughts, recall the evidence, and maybe change their behavior, and that they are only allowed to go over the test once before handing it in. We have a lot of evidence for this approach, and CBT works well for many people. However, overthinkers tend to come up with a lot of arguments, and overachievers have such high standards that thoughts like it's just 5 marks just isn't acceptable to them. They want those 5 marks. The reason I don't love CBT for overthinkers and overachievers was said really well by a famous ACT practitioner and trainer named Russ Harris, who said, I'm not going to debate my mind. Instead, I like to use the approach called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT for short, for overthinkers and overachievers. It steps around the debating the mind and allows the overachiever to keep their high expectations for themselves. Even though ACT is under the umbrella of CBT, it is actually very different than CBT. A session would unfold in a very different way. An ACT session would approach the same situation like this. The client might say, I think I only got 95% of my test today. I froze. I just couldn't think. I was so anxious. And there was this one really hard question. Rather than debating whether the 95% is acceptable or not, or pathologizing their anxiety, I would say something like, you noticed you felt really anxious when you didn't know the answer to that first question. It makes sense because it is so important for you to do well. Then we would follow up with activities that are designed to help the client feel more comfortable with their anxious feelings rather than reject or push them away. and help them detach from the thoughts that are upsetting. So, for example, I might have the client do an eyes closed exercise where we feel the body sensations of anxiety, and if it's a tight chest, notice that we can still breathe through the tight chest or around the tight feeling. Or if there's that, ball in the throat that we get with anxiety, that feeling of a ball, we can notice that we can make space around that ball to let the breath through, and really helps the client understand that even when anxiety shows up, we can manage it and achieve what we still want to achieve. Fear of failure is normal, so we can learn to manage the feelings of anxiety and do what's important to us. The therapist would also help the client distance themselves from that upsetting thought, possibly by asking them how helpful this thought is. Does getting hooked and caught up in the thought about failure help move you towards achieving a high mark? Likely they notice it gets in the way. We might follow up by doing a mental time travel exercise where we imagine getting the mark back that we really wanted, to help practice shifting the mind off that super highway of anxiety to that less traveled path of happiness and reward. ACT allows the overthinker to get a break from their mind's constant chatter and allows the overachiever to maintain their high standards and even encourages them. To get more details on strategies from ACT and how they can help your overthinking and overachieving mind, be sure to check out this other video. Thanks for listening.